Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Giri-Murthy, and this is the podcast where we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is an economist who wants us to rethink the idea that capitalism is simply the natural order of things. Klara Mataï is an author and professor of economics whose work explores how economic ideas become tools of power, shaping policy while masking the political decisions beneath. Her new book, Escape from Capitalism, argues that many of the problems that we see as inevitable, poverty, unemployment, inflation, are built into the system and shored up by models and theories designed to convince us that there is no alternative. Welcome to the podcast.
It's such a pleasure.
I mean, how can you escape capitalism? I mean, we are all brought up to believe or to think that it is just the way of the world. It is human nature to want to accumulate things and wealth and to have the freedom to choose what you want and what your destiny is.
So the first point is to escape the mental trap that naturalizes the system, that makes us think exactly what you just said, which is that we have a spontaneous tendency towards this capitalist economy. What I show in the book is that capitalism is far from spontaneous. It requires constant, violent enforcement of those policies of austerity to preserve the system in place. So what the state needs to do is to protect the market by keeping the majority of us subordinated to the market itself and maintaining us in a situation by which we have no alternative but to go work for wage, and usually a very low wage and very precarious conditions.
So what is capitalism in your terms?
Capitalism is a system based on two pillars. One is wage labor, exactly the idea that the majority on the planet has no option but to go sell their capacity to work in return for a wage and produce much more value than what they actually get in their paycheck and have very little say on how things are produced and why. And on the other hand, private investment. So the idea that it's actually very few that we have basically as society delegated the command over what is produced and why. So private investment and wage labor are the two pillars. And of course, the roof is production for profit. The fact that nothing we have around us would be ever produced if it weren't for the fact that there's expectations to get more money from what you started off with.
I mean, are you, so to what extent are you different from the anti-capitalist protesters who've been around forever, who are a tiny minority, but you're sort of respectable and at a university and not hiding your face?
So I think right now we're in a situation in which the violence of the economy has reached a very, very obscene peak. We know right now that we have actually 12 people in the world owning more than the bottom 4 billion people. We have soaring poverty, inequality that is extreme. We know the climate catastrophe, constant wars and militarism and genocide. People are suffering. So actually, the point is to say that if we want our basic needs met, if we want people to even get fed, we have 2 billion people who are suffering from food insecurity. If we want these basic needs to be met for everybody, you're an anti-capitalist, because the system is not meant to provide for the need. It's meant to provide for profit. And so what I'm trying to do here is shift the logic, again, propose a different lens through which we can say, we can't blame crony capitalism. We can't blame, excessive greed. We can't blame the idea that the system is not working as it should. And this is why we have all the inequality and the suffering. It's the opposite. The system is actually working as it's always been structured to work. And this is why we have such high accumulation at the top while the majority suffers. And we know that the reality is that even in Britain, the reason why we have so much wealth in the West, again, very divided. In the UK, 1 out of 3 children are in poverty. And since 2014, we have had billionaires grow 6-fold. Okay, so while billionaires keep growing, children keep getting poorer. And what we see is this, if in the UK, the wealth is distributed very unequally, the reality is that the West is basing its capacity to develop on the structural underdevelopment of the global South. And this is very important. Still today, when supposedly colonialism is over, we have $65 billion or more every year that flows from the global south, especially Africa, to Europe and the United States.
Because of debt.
Because of debt, because of extraction of resources, because of the fact that, capital, we invest and we take everything out, so also in terms of profit. So it's the dependency, how development is there because there is the creation of underdevelopment. This is the thing, we're not on an equal path in which we're all growing progressively and getting better and better. What you see is actually the fact that those countries that have developed because the rest was going down and was underdeveloped, it was structurally destroyed. And this is what austerity policies are all about. And austerity is a basic feature of capitalism. And this is, I guess, what distinguishes my work from other critical political economy, is to say that austerity is not irrational. It's irrational for us for the logic of need, but it's very, very rational for the logic of profit. Why? Because it keeps us in a subordinate condition. It keeps us needing to go work for whatever job to pay our bills and to pay for healthcare and education. So if you cut social services, as the capitalist state does, while financing private investors, de-risking, militarizing the surveillance economy, the protection of the borders, this is what capitalism needs, because it protects the two pillars, right? You keep wage labor and private investment in check.
So you're saying that when people say austerity is a necessity, in a way they're right, because it is a necessity of the system.
Yes, and this is the point. It is a necessity, but it's not a natural necessity. So this is the big point, is that it's not a technical fix. Austerity is not just a tool that economists with their neutral models adopt to save us all. It's the opposite. It's the point that economic models, as I show in the book, are deeply classist in the sense that they depict the problems as being due to workers misbehaving. This is how inflation is understood. Why is there inflation? Oh, because the cost of labor are too high, or because people are consuming too much. This is literally what the models say. So if the culprits are the workers, the solution needs to be increasing interest rates so that you create actually harsher unemployment levels. And unemployment, guess what, is actually important for the system. We would not have capitalism without a good dosage of unemployment. Why? Because if the workers did achieve bargaining power, they wouldn't accept these conditions that allow for profit to keep accumulating. So this is really important, is to realize that austerity is not neutral, it's political, but it's also necessary for this economic system. But I think the empowering element of the conversation is that capitalism is not spontaneous, and it has been around for very little time. Only 0.1% of the time Homo sapiens has been on the planet have we been under industrial capitalism. And in this little time, we've managed to destroy, as we know, our ecology and many people around us.
Did you mean just post the Industrial Revolution, basically?
Yes.
But even before that, wasn't it essentially a capitalist system?
Yes. Definitely. It was, capitalism was born in the UK. So the cradle of capitalism is right here where I stand today, through the enclosure system. And this is very important. This is a story that economics never tells you, because economics as a discipline is deeply ahistorical, purposefully to make you think that this is a natural, spontaneous order. The reality is that if you look at history, our economic system was born through violence. And what was this violence? It was the exclusion of people from the land. The land was the basic means of subsistence in which people could reproduce themselves autonomously from respect to the market. Once you eliminate the self-sufficiency, then people become market dependent, and thus, in a way, necessarily have to accept going to work for whatever situation they can find.
Well, wasn't that a product of natural human nature, to acquire and to exercise power over others?
I don't think so. If you look at all the indigenous cultures in many places in the world, I'm in Oklahoma right now. This was the reservation land after the indigenous people had been kicked out. They had the trails of tears. Many, many died, and they reached this reservation land, and then all the oil was stolen from the indigenous people. But the indigenous people, the Cherokee Nation, for example, was based on circular horizontal organization through councils. And actually, women had a very, very big role there. And it was about caring for the commons, caring for nature rather than extracting. So, indigenous values tell you that actually humanity has no essence for self-interest. This is the adaptation under capitalism. We can be different according to what social relations we construct. In Tulsa, the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation, I now founded, very interesting experiment to try to bring back these different social relations that need to start locally, because it's at the local level that we can associate through assemblies in which you show how collectively we can think to be together in a different way and pressure our local and national institutions to do not austerity, but democratic decision-making over the budget and much else.
Well, where does democracy come in? Because the defenders of the system will say these are choices that people have made deliberately through their democratic rights.
Well, I would say that these choices have been made by a tiny elite since the very beginning. And they are choices that by definition require the lack of economic agency of the majority. So what you see is that democracy, liberal democracy, is really only a superficial facade. And this is why in my work, historical work, I also show how in moments in which people challenge this capital order, liberals and fascists are great allies. And this has been my work on the post-First World War period, is you see that Benito Mussolini was adored by the Bank of England and by Montagu Norman because he was the right man at a critical moment to keep workers in check and to avoid post-capitalist experiments. So this is the whole point, is that you see that liberal democracy presupposes economic coercion. And when people rise up against economic coercion, liberals and fascists are best friends to implement austerity.
So these are choices that people are making within a framework of coercion.
Absolutely.
In your framing. I mean, why then, when we have seen alternative economic models in the 20th century, have they all gravitated towards capitalism? Why in Russia,
right.
Why in China,
Yes.
Why in parts of India,
Yes.
do they all end up like us?
Yes. Well, I don't think it's because we have a magnetic attraction or a fair system. It's mostly because we impose our capital order globally, right? If one reads just the post-Second World Wars, the Golden Age period, the United States were actively imposing capitalism everywhere else in the globe, right? Through militarism, through coups. We have the CIA involved in really taking over during the Cold War to protect capitalism. So, there was nothing spontaneous about this. It's about really a struggle, a political struggle. And the political struggle happens geopolitically, but also within each country. And this is very important, is that, luckily with Trump, we're seeing what capitalism actually looks like. And he's revealing the face of the brutality of the United States. In Tulsa, where I live, people can't afford anything. People don't have teeth. People can't afford to actually have a roof over their head. Many of the people who we organized through the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation are unhoused, and they barter food stamps as the only way to actually make a living. It's a situation in which the money exists, but it's really caught in the hands of very, very, very few philanthropists that, by the way, then benefit from lending money to the city, lending money to the governments, and then get all the interest back.
So, and yet some of the poorest people in America are Trump supporters. So how have they achieved this hegemony over people who have nothing to gain from it?
This is why I think my book can be relevant for people. It's because it's about the narrative. Again, the way we break free is first mentally. And what you need to see is that Trump is thriving on a narrative that has been constructed by mainstream economists for a long, long time, which tell you there's nothing unjust about this economy. If you are at the bottom, it's because you deserve it. And this is constructed through also mathematics and telling you that those who are at the top are there because they saved, they behave more rationally, and they are benefiting everyone else by employing everyone else, and so they should be lucky. So this methodological individualism, this idea that if you're poor, it's your fault, is spread everywhere, and people have internalized it so deeply that the only explanation they have for the fact that they're living not a human life at the end of the day, because it's dehumanizing what you see in the United States today. You blame it on those who are even weaker than you, because those are the ones who you fear the most, because you don't see who's actually benefiting. You don't see those, 19 people in the United States, which is the 0.00001% of the population, have increased their wealth in the past 2 years by almost $2 trillion. Only 19 people. This is what we're talking about when we talk about this extreme red. And these people are not taxed, because capital gains are not taxed. This is part of the austerity policies I was mentioning.
But isn't it the case as well that when you have very little and when you have great economic insecurity, you are desperate to hold on to whatever you have? So talking to people about breaking the system means that they will lose everything, is what they fear in the short term.
I think right now, first of all, many people have very little to lose at this point in the United States, really. I mean, 77% of American workers live paycheck to paycheck. Half of the homeless population that keeps skyrocketing in the US, 118,000 more homeless people, and this is just the official statistics in just 1 year. These people, work. Half of the homeless population actually has a job. So, working is not enough to secure your survival. So this is what I'm seeing with the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation, is that people want to come together with alternative models, with solidarity-based economies, with mutual aid, with the idea that let's breach market dependence, let's take back our relation with nature, with land, with resources. We need to create this alternative infrastructure that can actually serve the logic of need, that the governments, both at the local and at the federal level, and also in Europe, can no longer support, because our governments are there to maintain the capital order in place. And the fact that Europe is militarizing like crazy while people are losing their social services is not by chance. It's not to be, attributed to the bad person in power at that moment. This is the tendency of the system that we, though, have the power to fight against, because the system is us. And this is the empowering message of the book, is to say, we've built it. We need to see how the systemic forces trap us and shape us, but we're the architects. So there is space for alternatives if we build them.
Are we also trapped by our education system and the way economics is framed and taught?
Completely. So I'm a professor of economics, and I've for years tried to introduce alternative frameworks in the economics discipline. They do exist. They're at the margins. So anyone who who studies economics rarely gets exposed to alternative frameworks. And in my book, I try to expose the classical political economy framework. So it's built on not just my ideas. Yeah. This work is built on a tradition that is very strong. It dates to Adam Smith himself, the founding father of modern economics.
Well, people are taught about Marx, aren't they? And that's the only alternative way of looking at the world.
Yes, well, I think absolutely the important point is that, Marx has been demonized in all ways, but at the end of the day, he was one of the most important economists ever existed, because again, he did not accept the narrow idea by which things happen because of individual choices. Things happen because of systemic forces that have been built by us. And what Marx says that is very important and liberating is that capital as wealth, as money, is nothing but this surface expression of capital as a social relation, of the fact that we relate to one another in production processes that are very anti-democratic.
I mean, what I mean is, you say people are not taught any alternatives.
Ever.
I'm saying they are taught about Marxism. Are you saying the way Marxism is taught?
Okay, so this is important. I think very few people are actually taught about Marxism. Definitely, if you take an econ class, you will not hear his name or even the word capitalism. As a matter of fact, you only hear about markets and individual choices and maximization. So when you do hear the word Marx, it's usually attributed to some crazy deterministic way of seeing the world, which doesn't make any sense, because again, the critique of political economy that Marx brings about is exactly to say, you economists take for granted capitalism. I, as a scholar, a historical-minded scholar, will tell you that capitalism is a specific socioeconomic system that requires specific social relations, and we can change it because it's us who have built it.
So are you a neo-Marxist?
I've definitely been inspired by Marxian political economy, and I think this is really important for economic students to go back to the original texts.
Does that make it almost impossible for you, given everything you said, to gain traction?
No, I think the opposite. I think right now, historically, we're in a moment in which people are fed up by the liberal narrative that can't explain the current crisis of humanity we're living in. And so the Marxian tradition is a tradition that actually speaks to people who consider themselves on the right or considers themselves, Trumpist or whatever, because it goes to the real root of the problems. So in the end, if you want to get fed, you are an anti-capitalist, and you will see that only like a critical, really a critical lens, not a superficial lens, a critical lens that I try to develop in this book will be the source for emancipation of your mind and of your actions. And so I think we are in a historical moment in which people are thirsty for radical explanations that can push us beyond. And until we try it, we can't, predict. But right now, what we know is that the current situation is getting worse and worse as we speak.
What I mean is, if you are taking a lot from Marx, does that make you, for huge numbers of people, public enemy number one? If you think about how America responded to communism after the Second World War in this sort of almost hysterical way, but much deeper in terms of foreign policy and all the rest of it, that is still deeply ingrained in American psyche.
Yes.
And in Europe to some degree as well, for different reasons, but the fall of the Berlin Wall and all of that.
But I think that speaks to the reason why Marxian analysis is so powerful, because it was so scary that it needed to be purged from academia. It was a political project. Like academics were, you can read the Powell report. It's all about a project of purging academia from critical knowledge. And this is the whole point, is that part of it is this demonization of Marx. But, the most emancipatory tradition, you see the Frankfurt School, Antonio Gramsci, Rosa Luxemburg, people who were for the liberation of humankind. So what I do is to say, let's drop old categories. Let's think about ways, reclaiming words. Like freedom is a word that should be reclaimed in the radical tradition. We're not for the state. The idea that Marx is a statist is absurd. Marx was seeing the capitalist state as a problem and as an oppressive machine. And this is the whole point. Actually, Marx was vindicating the idea of freedom and agency and subjectivity and collective welfare. And this is the problem, is that if we still are trapped in categories that made sense during the Cold War, we will never look forward. So I want to reclaim the word freedom, the word economic democracy, because these are words that I think can connect people much more.
And how do you actually think change would happen? Are you revolutionary?
We are testing alternatives on the ground. Academics love to preach about general ideas and never get involved. I think they're culprits. They're responsible. They're part of the problem. Even these supposed lefty scholars, they're part of the problem if they don't engage. And academia, even on the left, is so elitist and so separate from people's problems and people's ways of thinking that, again, they are responsible. So what we're trying to do in Tulsa, again, Tulsa is, I think, one chapter of what I hope will continue building as a pilot project that can be reproduced with its own characteristic everywhere else, is the idea that knowledge is of the people, for the people, coming and stemming from people's participation. And that's why we do public education. That is really the first step. And then we organize through an assembly that is a way for people to try out something different.
But what does getting involved mean? I mean, you don't just mean protest movement, do you? I mean, should they be involved in local government, in collectives?
So to give you an example, we just had a big event with 400 people, which is a lot for Tulsa, with the mayor sitting there to respond to a conversation about participatory budgeting. Participatory budgeting is a reality that has been completely excluded from the way we run our economy, because it's dangerous for the status quo, but it's something that was invented in Brazil, actually, and we should really look at in the 80s. It's the idea that people can take on responsibilities in ideating how their money should be spent and voting on it in a way that actually is much more inclusive. This is happening in some parts of the world, but this could be, for example, an instrument to get people to realize that they can have much more agency. That's the value workers produce. It's overly taxed because it's workers that pay taxes, not investors. Okay. And that money that is being taxed, it's used not for people and their social services, but again, to foment wars in the south of the globe. So the whole system is completely irrational that we need to completely subvert it. Marx would tell us we live in an upside down world. And he was right. We do live in an upside down world. So what I'm saying is that we need to propose these alternatives. Putting pressure on the local governments is one possibility. So as an institution, as the Free, we are now launching a campaign for participatory budgeting, which is all about taxing the wealth in town through actually income taxation of the very rich. And at the same time, demanding that this money is not allocated according to the priorities of the usual suspects, but according to the logic of need. And this is something that can happen. It's realistic. It fits even within the constitutional framework and the current laws. It's just about political will.
So at the moment, you think democracy is the vehicle to deliver change, even though you think democracy is corrupted and underpinning, economics as we know it of capitalism.
So what I would tell you is that I think we need to be more specific of what we mean by democracy. There's liberal democracy, which is again this oligarchic farce by which very few make decisions, and then we as consumers get to come vote once in a while and we feel like we're so empowered, but actually we count nothing. And on the other hand, participatory democracy, which is based on people actually having a say on the material conditions that we are building. So what does this look like? It looks like different ways. The time I was reading that I studied are the factory councils of someone like Antonio Gramsci, which was about workers actually deciding on how to produce and why. Now it's about neighborhood councils that exist in Latin America. They're very strong, for example. In Tulsa, the idea is that through this assembly, we can start breaching market dependence. For example, again, organizing groups of people that go back to the concept of food sovereignty. How do we achieve food sovereignty? In Oklahoma, 1 out of 4 children suffers hunger. And the only way to get this to stop is if we gain back access to food and we fight against food deserts. And this is one of the possible ways in which we can have participatory democracy in action.
So a political party is not necessarily the vehicle to deliver this?
I don't think you necessarily need a political party, especially what parties look like today, especially in a country like the United States.
So, but if you're a scholar of sort of Gramsci, I mean, how do you achieve that persuasion of enough people?
That's very important. So Gramsci has deeply influenced my ideas because Gramsci is the person who came up with the idea of hegemony, right? Is the idea that capitalism is strong because capitalism is able to rule, the capitalist elite rules not only by coercion, but also by consensus, right? And this is what hegemony is about. It's about convincing those who are suffering that actually the system is doing their interest. And this is the way you get people to comply, to like passively accept. So what we need here is something that goes two ways. You need a public education that is more critical and historical. And this is kind of what I tried to do in my book to like, again, it's not just me. A lot of people are doing it, but I'm trying to make it accessible in a way that I think a lot of scholars have lacked interest in doing. At the same time, public education has to go with participation and institution building. This is what Gramsci was doing. He was saying the only knowledge that actually is interesting knowledge comes from participation and construction of counter-hegemonic spaces.
How do you get the middle class, the people with some money, to buy into this when they only stand to lose?
I don't think they stand to lose. That's the whole point, is to realize that the alliances are much broader. The middle class is really a construction that, by the way, now is completely disappearing because that so-called middle class, what matters...
There's the struggling middle class, yeah, of course. But there is also a middle class with resources.
Absolutely. But the point is that class is not defined by your bank account. It's defined by your social positioning within the social relations of production. So the question to ask is, where does the majority of your income come from? Does it come from labor or with a paycheck, or does it come from investment and capital gains and rent? This is your class positioning. Then you can be a worker that is better off than other workers. But the point is that as the system stands, the system is disintegrating all those social resources that are allowing those happy workers to still maintain a better life. And these people are being tracked down. We know the middle class in the United States basically doesn't exist anymore. And it's a paradox because the American dream was based on the idea that everyone, if they worked hard enough, they could achieve a car, a refrigerator, and, television. But this is, again, reducing us to consumers. We can be much more humane if even people like me, I'm a professor of economics. I'm not starving in the street. I do pretty well, but I still will gain into humanity if I participate in a collective that is not just my family and my neighbor, but actually people at large that come together through assemblies and try to actually take decisions together. This is how we transform our humanity into something much more fulfilling.
What are you asking people to do about their private property? I mean, particularly middle class in America and Britain means slightly different things, I think. But, certainly in Britain, you have a middle class that is home owning, property owning. That is their economic security.
That's great.
Are you saying they've got to give it up?
No, but this is another myth about Marxism. Marxism never said that we should get rid of,
But that is their capital gain. That's where they make their wealth, isn't it? Land and property.
Absolutely. But the point is that the majority of their income, I assure you, comes from wages. So again, it's not a binary workers capitalist, but it is important to keep track of the most important situatedness. So the idea here is that everyone should be able to have a roof over their head and afford a roof over their head, right? And so we need to make sure that this is a reality for everybody. And we know that this economic system is actually buying out these people to make us all into renters that then again have to spend a lot of time to try to find a job to be able to make that rent. So the point is that if you're lucky enough to own a house, that is what you should imagine everyone else being able to achieve. And by the way, right now, owning a house is a real pain. If you're a property owner, you know that it's a very individualistic mindset. There's plenty of alternative ideas of collective ownership that are much more empowering because you don't need to worry about, something breaking or paying the property tax. It would be a much more emancipated space in which everyone could think about the housing as a political project.
And you clearly think this is a moment for your ideas because of the extremes that capitalism, particularly in the West, is throwing up.
Yes. And I do think that the cause of the liberation of Palestine, I talk about Palestine in the book by looking at the economic dimension of the subordination of the Palestinian territories towards Israel and the West, and showing how that is just a microcosm of the subordination of the whole global South, where the majority of the population lives of the world, right? 7 out of the 8 billion actually live in the global South. And so how these are moments in which you see that people standing up for crude injustices, people can wake up and say, we need something different. And I really do think that connecting the struggles and seeing that they're all one struggle, it's a struggle for humanity over profit, is very important.
But again, if you go to the global South, development is all based around mimicking the Western capitalism of the global North.
Completely. And that's a real problem. And that's why underdevelopment keeps growing. And this is the whole point, is that economists have this myth. And it's really interesting because it was this economist called Walter Rostow who came up with this non-communist manifesto about how to develop countries in the global South. And the myth is that we're all the same, the United States, Britain, and Africa. All countries are the same. They could potentially all be on the same development path. It's just about where you are. They're just behind us, but the path is the same. The trajectory is universal. This is a lie. If you ask critical scholars on dependency theory, it's the opposite. It's actually the trajectory of some countries going up are based on other countries going down. So there will never be a universal trajectory. And this is really important, is for these countries in the global South to realize that if they listen to the IMF of the World Bank and open up their markets and implement more austerity, privatize, deregulate labor, do the whole recipe that supposedly is going to help them be more efficient, they are losing as they're doing that. And that's why
the trouble is the elites running those countries gain.
Exactly. So the debt increases in these countries. The elites are gaining both internationally and locally, but the workers are losing.
So I am still wondering how the workers unite, in your world without a revolution. Aren't you a revolutionary ultimately?
Well, I think revolution is, again, a word that we've associate with such negative connotation, right? Blood, disaster. Again, it shows you how indoctrinated we are, because revolution just means social transformation and change. And if there's blood, it's usually because there's a reaction to revolution, right? There's actually reaction coming to those at the top who don't want any social transformation. So revolution is really actually a positive word, because it just means change. It means change. And as humans, we deserve change to fulfill our full human prosperity.
So if you could just change the world now with one fell swoop, what would you do?
I would prioritize the two most important issues right now, that are the physical violence and the killing of people, not just in Palestine, in Sudan, and many other places, and food as a primary resource. And I would try to organize these two priorities as society's priorities. And this is very important, because this is potentially revolutionary and subversive. This is the thing. If you want people to get fed, you are a revolutionary, because the logic of profit will never bring you there. So we need to say, as a society, we are intelligent agents. We can change things. Let's set ourselves basic priorities. Everyone will agree that people deserve to have a plate in front of them once a day at least. Everyone will agree that children should not be slaughtered by our drones. So this is the basic thing. How do we collectively operate to achieve these goals without being dependent on the logic of profit? Because currently the idea is that if we depend on profit, then as a byproduct, people will get fed. And this is completely irrational. Again, it's upside down. Let's see how collectively we can have two priorities that are very basic, and people on the right, on the left, or wherever will say it's just so basic, it has to, we can't agree. And let's figure out how to do that. And what I would say is that we will need to do this by focusing on use value, on the materiality, on food itself, rather than on value as abstraction, as money. And if we can do this, things will start to change. And I think we need to start locally. I think the thing is that we can't, it's very scary to think in a global context, because we feel so disempowered, because we feel so little. The idea is not we start local, but we think global, because if we have different chapters of these alternative institutions that are actually devoted to achieving these needs, then things can change. And I think this is why you can collaborate with local institutions and with governments, but you need to pressure them to do things differently, because on their own, they'll never do it, because they're listening to the technocrats that have these economic models that tell them that the problem are the people rather than the system.
Clara, Mataï, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hope you enjoyed that. You can watch all of these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Until next time, bye-bye.